Science of South Africa webinar on mental health and bullying. Just right up front, I'd like to say thank you to Kotso. Many of you will have received emails, and thank you for all your impeccable organizing of this webinar. Before I introduce the speakers, just one point of clarity. We're going to go through each of the speakers. There's 3 of them this afternoon, and then at the end, we'll open up for questions and answers. We're not going to do that after each talk, just to ensure that the speakers number 2 and particularly number 3 don't then run out of time. And we'll do that by raising hands or questions in the chat block. I will monitor that and then feed through questions at the end to each of the speakers. Very, very briefly, just an introduction. When I was asked by ASSAf to be part of this webinar, my first thought that I had, it happened to come very, 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 very soon after a number of certain incidents from amongst our leaders, where there was a particular fight in Parliament followed by a particular fight at a press conference. And I was struck by how we South Africans, we do have a particular propensity to think that the first port of call for resolving any dispute is some form of violence, and it's not the last resort very often. It's the very first one, and I think that all falls into a sort of a broader notion of aggression, of violence, of stress, of anger, of a whole lot of things. And so I think this is a particularly apt webinar, and the 3 speakers are all excellent, and we'll try and tease apart some of this, the impacts on mental health, and I just sort of also think the final point is to also see bullying as we often see bullying as something that only happens in schools. But in fact, I think very often parents can be bullies. We only need to look at the previous president of the United States to see a bully as a leader of a country. Bullying takes many, many forms, and sometimes the victims of bullying do become bullies themselves, but actually not as often as one might imagine. And so dealing with this, whether it's in our school, whether it's in our broader society, I think is absolutely vital. And I know the 3 speakers will speak to its impacts, the sort of some of the reasons for, and then I think also some of the solutions. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, which is Professor Anthony Pillay, who is in the Department of Behavioural Medicine at the UKZN Medical School, as well as Fort Napier Hospital. He's a Harvard graduate, and he's held a number of appointments in Boston Children's Hospital in the US, as well as the University of Mauritius. He's currently the editor-in-chief of the South African Journal of Psychology, associate editor of the Journal of Child and Adolescent Mental Health. He was awarded a fellowship of SAIS's 25th Anniversary Congress. His research interests include psychology, professional training, as well as women and children's mental health. He received his postdoctoral training in maternal and child health at Harvard University, and he's widely published in academic journals internationally. And his title of his talk is The Self-Esteem Factor in the Developmental Trajectory of Bullying. Over to you, Prof. Pillay. And I will start waving or speaking or something with about 5 minutes, and then yeah, so off you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tomlinson, for that kind introduction. And yes, I agree. Given the time constraints, let's get directly into it. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Just want to check if that's okay. I suspect you can.
Yes, we
see
can.
My screen.
Yes. Yeah, got it.
Thank you, Prof. So firstly, thank you for the invitation from the Academy of Science of South Africa to do this presentation. And as Prof. Tomlinson mentioned, this is such a topical issue. Does not affect just children. Of course, for my presentation, I'm looking at children, but clearly and hopefully you will see as I go through this, that the issues that I'm describing largely center around personality development, actually then factor in as individuals grow up and become adults. And here and there, I will also mention some of the issues that affect adults. So with the time constraints, I'm going to speak specifically on self-esteem, a little bit on the broader issue of personality. And the reason I want to talk about self-esteem is because I've happened to have tracked this particular construct in human development, in psychology, in mental health for several years. And I believe it is critically related to the issue of bullying and how we see the problem in its entirety, both in children and even in adults. We all know how bullying presents, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but in order to contextualize the presentation, we are looking at behaviors that include picking on smaller children or younger children, violence, physical aggression, emotional abuse, teasing, name-calling, mockery, threatening, harassing, taunting behavior, as well as hazing, which is coming more and more into the fore. This is a kind of ritual, if you want, that tends to occur in some schools and universities and colleges as a way of humiliating new entrants. In addition, we're looking at issues of social exclusion, rumor mongering, and this includes, of course, online or cyberbullying, as we now know it. The manifested behaviors really are an attempt to be seen as a person with power. And this is the critical component of what I wanted to talk about for the rest of this presentation. The individual seeks to be seen, to be recognized as somebody in power, dominant, and almost a tyrant. Very much like what Professor Tomlinson just mentioned a little while ago about one of those world leaders. In fact, unfortunately, it's a few leaders that that we see around the world like this. Now, you may have seen this particular news report about 2 or 3 weeks ago. In fact, it was less than 3 weeks ago, probably about 2 weeks ago. Quite shocking, but certainly not new. Although it involves a school teacher, it is still the same issue of humiliating a child, which is completely unacceptable and does serious damage to children. In this particular case, a school child who was apparently humiliated by a school teacher over his sexuality killed himself later that day after school. Sadly, this type of response is quite frequent. And with tomorrow being World Suicide Prevention Day, I think it is opportune that we remember the thousands of children around the world who have killed themselves or made attempts on their lives because they were bullied. It's a very serious problem. Now, research has demonstrated that young people who are bullied are more prone to depression and suicidal behavior. This US study, just a few lines of which I have on the screen, found that adolescents were at least 5 times more likely to have suicidal thoughts than those who have not been bullied. Now, we have no reason to believe that a similarly increased vulnerability to suicide is not evident here in our country or anywhere else in the world, because it is a global problem. some years ago, the Bulletin of the World Health Organization carried an editorial highlighting the need to prevent bullying-related morbidity. We don't usually think about morbidity, but it is a serious concern, both in terms of direct injury or death, as well as the indirect effects of mental health problems such as depression, anxiety, suicide, and various other health consequences. UNICEF also came out quite strongly on the issue pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident. This is actually a very good way to think about bullying. In other words, that it is a pattern of behavior. Because for us in mental health care or in psychology, we think or we speak about a pattern of behavior as relating to personality. So when we're speaking about a pattern of behavior, we're largely referring to individuals' personality, how personality develops. And I'm going to be talking a bit more about that as we go through, because this is really where this presentation is pointed. If we look at the role players in the bullying scenario, there is the perpetrator, the child who is being targeted, and there are often bystanders, especially in school situations, especially with children. There are often bystanders on the playground, etc. Although this is not always the case. We've got to remember that bullying does take place in isolation when there's nobody else around. In fact, some bullies prefer that kind of context, but very often, especially in school contexts, there are bystanders. Now, I mentioned that because we have to look at what the mental health effects are for the various people involved in the entire bullying scenario. The mental health fallout, however, affects everyone involved. For the targeted child, there could be direct injury, depending on just how severe the bullying behavior is. But then there's also indirect injury or emotional trauma, or self-esteem damage, and even a host of mental health problems. I'll deal with some of these a bit later. For the perpetrator, the bullying generates a false sense of self-esteem. It reinforces antisocial tendencies and conduct problems. And the likelihood of developing mental health and conduct problems is very significant. Now, conduct problems in itself is a serious problem in our society. And conduct problems, for those of us in mental health, it's a term that we use to describe very severe behavioral problems that develop over time, over middle to late childhood, and more so in adolescence. And of course, can develop further into what we refer to as an antisocial personality disorder, which is more characteristic in adults. These are, very simply to understand, these are these are the kinds of individuals who are more likely to engage in criminal behavior, in violent crimes, and land up in prisons. Or even if they don't land up in prisons, they really make things very difficult for the rest of us in society. Bystanders are also affected in terms of mental health. Witnessing bullying can be a traumatic experience. It is also a negative social learning experience, and that is, of course, in itself a serious issue, because We talk about this a lot. The more we can give children a positive social learning experience from everyone, from their parents, from school teachers, from other children, the better for the child in terms of role. In trying to understand the risk factors in the development of bullying, we must accept that there are probably many. I've grouped them in a very simplistic manner here, just to keep this presentation quite straightforward, into familial, environmental, and personality factors. And largely because it is the personality component that I want to deal with mainly. Familial factors here include family functioning and all of the other variables within the home life of the child. Environmental factors include the social, peer group, and the host of other influences from outside the family. Personality factors refer to the child's characteristic way of interacting with the world. In mental health and in psychology, when we speak about personality, we are actually referring to the very distinctive pattern of thinking, feeling, and behaving over the course of childhood and adolescence, and even into early adulthood. So the field of personality research is evolving all the time. In fact, research now suggests that personality development begins even before birth. In interacting with the world, the individual's thoughts, and over time, a characteristic pattern develops, which is rather unique to that individual. And that is, of course, what sets the individual, what sets all of us apart from each other, our unique personality.
Prof. Pillay, just 5 minutes.
Okay, thanks. If we look at the personality features in bullying, we see a number of disagreeable characteristics, including a violent or aggressive behavior, controlling, lack of empathy, as well as disregard for rules and the need to dominate. The need to recognition is, of course, quite a significant issue because it relates to self-esteem. The term self-esteem or self-worth is commonly used and simply refers to how well we think of ourselves. Some people think positively of themselves and others think rather negatively about themselves. We get our self-esteem from a combination of biological and environmental influences, and about 60% of our personality, our self-esteem, is developed through our environment. Now, generally, we conceptualize self-esteem into high, low, and inflated self-esteem. Inflated self-esteem is the problem. That is the problem that we see a lot in people with bullying behaviors. If we look at a child who is bullied, they start out with low self-esteem, and as a result, they're easy targets for bullies. They feel insecure and worthless. This makes them even further targets for bullying. And of course, it results in mental health problems, including depression and suicidal behavior. Now, low self-esteem is a precursor to bullying. The research, however, shows some mixed results when we're looking at bullying perpetrators. Some suggest low self-esteem. Confusing. Things are quite simple. There are a number of reasons. One is that self-esteem research uses self-report instruments. So really it relies on the individual reporting how well he thinks of himself. So if we look at some of the Rosenberg self-esteem concept, self-esteem scale items, they ask questions like, I think I'm a person of worth, or I feel satisfied with myself. the average bullying is not going to score that in a negative way. Similarly, we know that bullies develop their self-esteem over time as they bully other children. So the bullying causes the self-esteem to artificially inflate. So if we look at the developmental trajectory for perpetrators, we find that it starts with low self-esteem. The bullying behavior inflates the self-esteem, and of course, it results in further dominant behavior, which leads to mental health problems like conduct disorder, antisocial personality disorder, etc. I'm nearly through. If we look at the developmental trajectory for targeted children, we find that they also start with low self-esteem. The bullying behavior that is thrust upon them results in even lower self-esteem. And the problem here is that this results in mental health problems that include suicidal behavior. And as I mentioned earlier, large numbers of children actually engage in suicidal behavior. So I want to conclude with some considerations for prevention, which on the surface are quite straightforward given what we know about the problem. Clearly, we have to build self-esteem in children so that they feel better about themselves. This can have the effect of helping them conduct themselves appropriately and respectfully without needing to violate the rights of others in order to feel good. Similarly, this approach can help others to feel secure in themselves and give them the personal strength to avoid the fearfulness and vulnerability that makes them easy targets for bullying. But we have to do this early. We cannot do this retrospectively or reactively when the problems show up. We can certainly make attempts to do this later, but we're less effective. We can build self-esteem through positive responding to children. Young children love praise and they thrive on it. Across the mental health spectrum, we know that a healthy self-esteem promotes well-being. Now, it's not a panacea, and I'm not touting it as a panacea, but it is a very easy, simple thing for us to do from the time the child is very young to praise children when it is deserved. Children love praise, they thrive on praise. So the more we can do this, it is a simple thing that we can do, but it is something that can have amazing impact on their development. So with that, I would like to say thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Pillay. Your timing was utterly impeccable, actually. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker, and just as a reminder, post any of your questions, and we will have time at the end for questions and answers. And let me move on to the next speaker. So our second speaker is Vanessa Hemp, who's a clinical psychologist who trained at Wits. She started her working life as a clinical psychologist at Tara Hospital with children, adolescents, and their parents. She became head of the Department of Psychology. I think presumably that is at Tara, managing and supervising the psychological service provision, yes, including the outpatient and outreach services. She was also involved in the training and supervision of interns, psychiatry registrars, as well as in the planning of the children's ward and training of staff. She had a role in the Alex AIDS Orphans Project, which was to identify the psychological needs of orphan children and to develop and supervise a number of bereavement group. She presented this at conferences, work at conferences, including the World Association of Social Psychiatry in Kobe, Japan. At Tara, she served as a joint appointee to the Wits University Department of Psychiatry. Since leaving the hospital, she has been in private practice, and she focuses on adolescence and parenting. She continues to present at conferences on topics related to children, adolescence, and parenting, addressing issues of affect regulation and assisting children, teens, and their parents to manage stressful situations and overwhelming feelings has been a major focus of her work. So she's very well placed to talk about the impact of bullying on mental health. Over to you, Vanessa.
Thank you so much for your warm introduction. It's a real pleasure to be speaking on this topic. I am going to go through some of the elements of my presentation quite quickly because they have already been dealt with by Prof. Pillay. I'm having a look at the impact of bullying on mental health and how mental health can invite people to be bullied. Sorry, I'm just struggling. Okay. In terms of bullying, in this section I'm going to go through very quickly. It has a look at an unequal power dynamic between the victim and the bully. Boys are more likely than girls to bully, and boys tend to use more direct methods than girls in terms of their bullying. In terms of the impact of being on the receiving end, they found that girls are more likely to have depression and self-esteem issues as a result of bullying. With direct methods of bullying, we have a look at physical aggression, hurtful words, unpleasant facial expressions and gestures. With indirect, it's ignoring, isolating, denying wishes, as well as subtle non-verbal communications. Cyberbullying, which has become to the fore in current years, involves both direct and indirect bullying. When they had a look at girls, they found that their mental health was more negatively impacted by bullying. And part of the theory behind this is that they have a greater investment in terms of peer status and friendships, leading them to internalize the negative experiences and be more greatly affected by the victimization. We have a look at three elements when having a look at mental health and bullying: the victim, the bully, and then the bully victim, who has both been bullied themselves and victimized. In terms of the degree of mental health difficulties, bully victims make up about 20% of this population and are found to have the most severe mental health difficulties. When we're having a look at people who do victimize others, low self-esteem and provocative aggression at the beginning of their bullying cycle has been found in terms of these kids being disturbed, as well as very high levels of impulsivity. Adverse home environments, as Prof. Pillay referred to, can predispose children to become bullies. Here, there can be a negative emotional attitude from the primary caretaker, where there's a lack of warmth, a lack of involvement, and this can point to, in terms of mental health, attachment difficulties in the relationship between the parent and the child, which is the base level upon which a whole of our personality develops. In the family as well, a tolerant or even permissive attitude to aggression, with no clear limits for aggressive behavior, as well as a bullying type stance in terms of child rearing, where power is asserted, there's physical punishment, and violent emotional outbursts are used by parents to control children and to raise them. In terms of the typical victim, what we find is they're often different in some way. This can be in terms of language, culture, race, religion, LGBTQR+, disabled. Victims can also present with mental health issues, and this can be one of the reasons they are targeted. They can be suffering from anxiety, depression, learning difficulties, or fall on the autistic spectrum. Generally, victims tend to have a more anxious temperament, low self-esteem, insecurity, and a lack of friends, and can be quite isolated. The other thing that we find is they can be quite emotionally reactive. So in terms of the dynamic that is set up, they react and respond in a way that bullies find quite gratifying. Easily dominated and not particularly aggressive. When we're having a look at kids and adolescents and their development, it's very important to bear in mind what is happening in the growing brain. And part of what is happening in adolescents in particular, which makes them more vulnerable to bully, as well as to struggle with the impact of bullying, is the fact that in terms of their brain development, they're in the middle of what they call the mismatched years. Their emotional center, the limbic region, which is where that sort of purple coil is being flooded with dopamine, which is our sensation-seeking neurochemistry, which wants us to go for strong feelings. We feel things very strongly. Boredom is something that is absolutely horrific, and all emotions are felt very, very strongly. But what we find is the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that is about emotional regulation, self-control, stopping and thinking, considering the consequences of our actions. This only comes online much later, and in fact is only fully developed and matured in the mid to late 20s. Unfortunately, for some people and for people who are their victims, this prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop and come online to help people stop, consider, and think about the impact of their actions. If we have a look at the cycle of bullying and mental health issues, what we find is that young people are more likely to develop mental health issues if they're bullied, as well as I mentioned earlier, young people with mental health issues are more likely to attract bullying because of their struggles. And here, if we start off by having a look at the impact of bullying on mental health, the bullying wears them down in terms of their confidence, their self-esteem, until they're quite depressed and low. It can also leave them feeling very isolated, which can be why, in conjunction with their low self-esteem, they don't reach out for help with the bullying. And this is involved in people being bullied as well as those bullying others. Then what can happen is it can result in a whole cascade of mental health issues. These include depression, anxiety, self-harm, self-esteem difficulties, and suicidal thoughts, and tragically, often suicidal actions. Then, if we have a look at starting off with mental health, if you self-harm or have an eating disorder and your peers know about it, then they start to see you differently and it can make you a target. Similarly, as with the case I'm going to present briefly, if you are on the autistic spectrum, struggle to read social cues, don't really fit in, this can make you a target of bullying. And then there is the vicious cycle that gets set up with both the perpetrator and the victim getting into worse and worse states of mental health. They have found that being bullied increases your chances of suffering depression as an adult by 30%. So this is not just something that impacts children and adolescents, but can bleed into the rest of their lives and cause them ongoing suffering. The other thing to bear in mind is during these formative years, a person's sense of self, their personality is forming and developing. Adolescents in particular are very sensitive to fitting in, belonging, feeling like they are seen, and they're forming their identities, and being bullied can impact and distort somebody's sense of themselves, which can in turn lead into all sorts of mental health issues. The other thing is that it's not just the bullying incident around it, but what happens, the incident itself, but what happens around it. People's responses. Are people sympathetic? Do they just stand by as passive bystanders? Is there a sense of being able to get help? Is the bullying being taken seriously? If it isn't, what they have found is that PTSD can result and on some level can have a similar impact to childhood emotional abuse on the growing and developing person, which then has long-term implications for their mental health. They have theorized that 83% of people experience some form of mental health issues throughout their lifetime. 75% of these start before they turn 18. They've also found, as I've said, that in research with college students, that those who experience bullying had more mental health problems than their peers, and that the females tend to struggle more with the emotional damage inflicted by bullying, with higher levels of depression, anxiety, and PTSD. In terms of the case study, it is a 14-year-old girl that I actually still see. She's just turned 18. She was very bright, but had social difficulties throughout primary school, and school avoidance started in high school. She was diagnosed as being on the autistic spectrum only when she was 13 years old, in the first year of high school. She was extremely sensitive to noise, wore sound-cancelling headphones, had relationship difficulties, struggled to make friends, was very, very anxious, and tended to alienate teachers. She was isolated, different, and would retreat and withdraw into gaming to try and find some space that had meaning. When in the beginning of her grade 8 year, about halfway through, her teacher decided to try and perform an intervention. And I think what was happening is the teacher themselves was quite aggravated and irritated with this client of mine. She invited the class to give her feedback as to why they struggled with her. The class circled around her, made personal attacks, called her arrogant, thoughtless, rude, judgmental. And this really felt like an example of teacher-sanctioned bullying. And the teacher stood aside and didn't intervene at all or provide any support, while my client just withdrew and quietly imploded, eventually running from the room in tears. After this, her school avoidance increased, her performance at school got much worse, and she started self-harming in order to manage her overwhelming feelings and became quite suicidal. In grade 9, there was another instance at the same school where they were busy doing presentations and she was wandering around to different classes. She considered herself an expert on Shakespeare that they were busy working on at that point, and Shakespeare was one of the things that she had sort of hyper-fixated on with her autism, and went around correcting students. This aggravated her teachers, and one of her teachers approached her, confronted her, telling her that she was behaving inappropriately. I don't think the teacher initially was too forceful, but she misread the situation, and my client ended up fleeing to the bathroom, refusing to come out, was totally traumatized. She didn't return to the school after this, ended up homeschooling, and has completed all of her high school career online homeschooling as a result of the trauma, and is only now that she is going to be going into varsity, considering going back to an in-person situation. Subsequently, she has come out as being non-binary and trans male, going with the pronouns. So here we have a child who had mental health issues, and then what happened is she got victimized as a result of them, which created even more mental health issues. And I think clearly illustrates how catastrophic this process can be.
Vanessa, 4 minutes. Okay.
Okay, great, thanks. It's very important for teachers and those around people being bullied to have a look at spotting the signs that bullying is happening, but also to check in terms of the impact that this is having on people's mental health. We have a look at changes in school performance, changes in behavior, increased isolation and withdrawal, changes in weight. People can stop eating because of anxiety or develop eating disorders in terms of trying to control things, so becoming anorexic or comfort eating and getting into cycles of bulimia. Looking for loss of interest in activities they used to enjoy, as well as signs of injury, both by others or if they are inflicting injury on themselves. Cyberbullying is a whole massive new area that we're having to deal with. And what they found is that those bullied in real life are more likely to be targeted online. There is not that much bullying that is just cyberbullying. What you find is victims are victimized in their environments, and then this is then continued online. What happens is technology can make these power plays much easier because people can do things online that they'd never do face-to-face. Things are published and get massive and overwhelming. Conflicts don't settle and turn into huge drama, infighting, intrigue. There are a whole range of different types of cyberbullying: harassment, impersonation, flaming, denigration, exclusion, outing, trickery, and cyber stalking. So cyberbullying, as well as normal bullying, can create all sorts of difficult emotional effects, as illustrated in this picture. If we have a look at the emotional impacts, feelings of humiliation, isolation, anger, and powerlessness can emerge. And then in terms of the mental effects, depression and anxiety can develop, self-confidence and worth becomes eroded, and that as the bullying gets higher and higher, the levels of depression and anxiety can become higher. What can happen then is that they can feel very overwhelmed, unable to cope, can either turn to self-harm to emotionally regulate or fantasize about dying in order to escape the pain and a life that has no meaning. So as you can see, this can be very catastrophic. Low self-esteem obviously plays into all of this, as spoken about by Prof. Pillay, and academic issues in terms of avoiding and skipping school can then create additional stress and strain, which add to anxiety and depression that they are feeling. Then lastly, there can also be physical manifestations and behavioural, which can then have a knock-on impact in terms of creating more mental health issues, like turning to drugs or alcohol, skipping school, carrying a weapon. Physically, gastrointestinal issues, real or as somatizing as a result of the anxiety, disordered eating, and then sleep disturbance. And disturbed sleep can be signs of PTSD, but can also lead to more anxiety and depression. So it's vital that bullying is addressed as early and as soon as possible, and that caretakers look out for signs so that intervention can happen early. Thank you very much. And sorry, that was very fast at the end. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. You also like spot on in time. So thank you so much, and thanks for your very interesting presentation. I'm now going to move on to our third speaker. And just to say, Prof. Pillay and Vanessa and Safiso, there are some questions in the chat box. And I mean, if you want to answer some of them by the chat box, type it in, that's fine. Or we can certainly address them in Q&A. So our third speaker is Safiso Ngobezi, who's the Director of Sport and Enrichment in Education at the Department of Basic Education. And that was the whole bio that I was given. But can I just say that I know Safiso, I know of him, and he's just being exceedingly modest. So but I haven't got anything else to say, so I'm just going to hand straight over to Sifiso, and he's going to talk about Department of Basic Education strategies to deal with bullying in schools. Over to you, Sifiso.
Thank you very much. Just checking if my screen is showing and that you can see the presentation.
Yep, and it's in presentation mode. Great. Perhaps what we should do, maybe if we're struggling a bit there, is Prof. Pillay and Vanessa. There were two questions that I saw in the questions or the question and answer block. Perhaps maybe you could have either one of you or both could have a sort of a stab at answering that. The first was about the issue of bullies, the victims of bullies, then becoming bullies in turn. And this was a question from Sharon, who said that she sees that as an issue in schools. And then the other was around kind of regulation, intensified emotion, given that for children and adolescents, prefrontal cortex is developing, and would breathing exercises at schools and meditation be potential solutions? So Vanessa, I can see you've got your camera off. Do you want to just take a quick stab at that?
Yes, I was actually just busy typing a response to Kyle about the prefrontal cortex, and absolutely techniques like breathing exercises, teaching people to meditate, guided meditations, as well as helping people track and notice what is happening in terms of their emotions and how to regulate them, really helps. And I think those sort of skills in schools are invaluable. Exercise is also very useful in terms of helping people with their aggression, but also with overwhelming feelings. In terms of the first question, what I wanted to say in terms of the bully victim, I think the earlier that the bullying behavior is identified, or somebody who is at risk of sort of becoming a bully is identified, and the child is intervened with, the better. Bullies should absolutely be sent for counseling to help them deal with their difficult feelings, as should victims. So the sooner any intervention can happen, the better.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. Prof. Pillay?
Thanks. Just really want to support what Vanessa's just said on both counts. The interesting thing with the use of techniques like meditation, etc., it's so good to know that over the last 20 years or so, perhaps slightly longer, there's actually been a lot of scientific data supporting the use of techniques like meditation, which were previously viewed largely as fringe approaches. But there's been a lot of controlled clinical trial data that's showing the effectiveness of these techniques, including things like yoga, etc., across many problems, not just with bullying. So certainly, I agree with that. The other issue regarding the individuals who have been bullied subsequently, being perpetrators of bullying, reminds one of the scenario that we find in the case of individuals who've been sexually abused when they were young. A number of those individuals subsequently become abusers of others later on. And so we're probably finding a similar kind of dynamic there that probably has a number of interesting psychological dynamics that we probably don't have the time to go into detail here. One of them could be social learning. The other could be the very simple defense mechanism that we all learned about in first year psychology of reaction formation, where this type of behavior can just be repeated, can be responded to. So yeah, I think that is certainly something that that can happen. Thanks
both. I mean, and we're going to just keep continuing with the question and answer session until that sounds like a beep. Does that mean yes? There's some hope. Which, given that 2 of the 3 questions that have arrived seem to be about school responses, proactive measures in schools, following through on plans. So I think, Safisa, welcome back. I hope that you can stay with us this time, because some of the questions you'll see seem to be directly addressed at what you're going to tell us. So back to you. You're on mute.
Okay, thank you very much. Apologies for that. I think there was a disturbance with the network at work, and then I was kicked out. Let me go back to sharing the presentation. Thank you. Yes, in terms of, I was just talking about the fact that bullying as well as school violence is a global problem that is there in all countries in the world, South Africa being one of those. And we have seen quite a number of cases that are going up, which is a major disturbance in our schooling system. So part of the problem is, the differences that we see in technology now that learners have got a cell phone in schools. It has created some kind of a challenge. I'm trying to move my screen. I see I have challenges in moving it. I will trust that it's moving from your side. Okay, I think it is moving now. I take a little bit of time. If you look there, 22% of learners reported to have experienced school violence in 2012. And that you look at the fact that about 3.2 million learners experience bullying annually in South African schools. And this is according to Safer Schools of 2015. This is quite a huge number. As you can see there, 57% of children have been bullied once in their high school careers. These numbers indicating, these percentages indicate that we really have, as a country, challenges when it comes to this. In terms of, if I may go just briefly on the definition of bullying, bullying involves one or more people singling out or deliberately and repeatedly hurting or harming another person. These are often, confused. It's often confused with teasing and the causes of bullying by learners in the schools, some of whom have been mentioned by Professor Pillay, as well as Mrs. Vanessa Hemp. Low self-esteem, which is really directed to the lack of affirmation. I think Vanessa mentioned this earlier on in her presentation, and the power of imbalance between the perpetrator and the victim. That is also another one. And learn bullying from others, and children tend to pick from others within the school. In terms of types of bullying, you have the physical part, which would involve touching and pushing, pulling, things like that, which is physical. There is also verbal, which talks to threats, insult, name calling, social, which is gossiping, spreading rumors, and homophobic. In some instances, you also get sexual, one where there are inappropriate jokes and inappropriate touching and things like that. We have cyberbullying these days because of cell phone and social media and people using those platforms to hurt each other. The non-verbal one, which looks at writing hurtful letters and insensitive messaging. And then the other one that will be talking to stealing and whether a person is forced to give his lunch or her lunch at school. I was once in a school where we didn't know as teachers at the time that there were toll fees that were charged to learners that are new in the school. as they move towards the toilets in the school and certain sanitation facilities, they were expected to be paying some toll fees or some monies in order for them to access those particular areas. This is just a slide which shows over the past years in terms of the numbers from 2003 to 2012, old data, as well as looking at, between boys and girls in terms of bullying and cyberbullying. The impact of school violence and bullying now coming to the academic classroom and the things that are likely to happen. Definitely, you're talking about harms, the harm of the physical health as well as the emotional well-being of children and adolescents. And you know that especially when children are going through the adolescent stage, the sensitivity of the information or what is being done or portrayed to have been done to them might actually lead them to a state of being that is really compromising a number of aspects when it comes to learning and effective learning in the classroom. And the manifestation of bullying in schools as well as violence is that you will find that learners are afraid to go to school, and it also often interferes with their ability to concentrate in class and participate in the activities that are prepared in the school. So the environment becomes an unsafe learning environment. It creates a climate of fear and insecurity. And as a result, then we will see learners dropping out of the school, learners not wanting to come to school, or also exhibiting antisocial behavior within the classroom and at school, or sometimes even at home. And then it can also increase the risk of social and relationship difficulties later on in life, antisocial and criminal behavior. I think this was touched on. I'm not going to dwell much on it. But just maybe to also share some of the warning signs that are there, which I think they were also touched on a little earlier, like missing schools, for example, having lower grades, a learner that has been known to have been performing very well. All of a sudden, there is a drop in terms of the marks and the performance in the class. And in some instances, learners dropping out from schools. And in terms of the impact in terms of mental health and emotional health, we know that once a learner has been a victim of bullying in a school situation, that particular person now moving forward as an adult is likely to be without education because maybe they might have dropped out of the school, without employment, and being on a lower band in terms of earning with their wages because of all this. And then in terms of, some of the impact, I think these were touched on earlier on, things like depression, stress, fear, loss of confidence, low self-esteem, and learners actually becoming suicidal. We have had a situation where a learner was bullied on social media to such an extent that they ended up taking their own lives. It's one of the things that is really troublesome in the current education space. What are the interventions that we are trying as a Department of Basic Education to ensure that schools deal with such behavior from learners that are, perpetrators of bullying, but also to equip schools in terms of what is it that they could do? We have, as a department, a national school safety framework. And in the framework, what we are promoting is that there has to be a prevention and management of bullying in schools. Teachers need to be equipped. Schools need to know what they need to do. We promote the issues of code of conduct in the school so that we can curb untoward behaviors. We have at the moment interdepartmental campaign. We work with other departments in government to ensure that it's not just the Department of Basic Education, but we involve other sister departments like Social Development, SAPS, South African Police Services, Department of Justice, Department of Correctional Services, to ensure that they join us in our campaigns that we roll out that are, about promoting anti-bullying in schools. But we also tap on our curriculum, which is life orientation. I will briefly explain that in the next slides. So in terms of the National School Safety Framework, our goal is to make sure that we create safe, violence and threat-free schools. That kind of environment is important for learners, for teachers, for everybody who is within the schooling community. And for the school to function optimally, a school has to be a child-friendly environment, where there are no threats, where there is no bullying, where there is protection of learners at all costs, whether they are in the sporting field or they are in the classrooms. That is what we believe that will retain learners in the system, and they will make schooling an enjoyable experience throughout their entire lives. In terms of the framework, it has got pillars, early identification of a problem and then intervention, which is something that we promote because we know that when a person is bullied and there is no action that is being taken by the school or the next office, which might be a circuit office, a district office, or even up to provincial and national offices, it tends to compromise learners, and you can even have dire consequences because when it is not handled at a school level efficiently, as it happens, as it arises, and that solutions are provided there, it becomes a problem. So one of the things that the framework, the school safety framework promotes is that it has to be reported. We normally require that schools report it to the next offices, but even on the electronic systems, so that these cases would be known, and also will make follow-up as to what has been done to that particular situation, so that it is handled and not just left without being a learner feeling that they are not supported. So it's reporting, support and care for the one who is a victim of bullying, as well as a safe and a responsive learning environment. So this is what, in a nutshell, the framework is all about and tries to promote. And then in terms of the prevention and the management of bullying in school, the goal there is to ensure that schools identify, prevent, and manage bullying incidences in the schools themselves without having to refer to higher offices, as I've explained earlier on, and that schools are trained on bullying prevention from provinces, and this training are continuing. We've recently had in some of the districts in the Northwest for this current financial year. And that the other is that schools are also required to develop anti-bullying policies. This is one of the ways of making sure that schools attend to it efficiently as well. If we just to summarize,
can I just ask that you finish up in 3 to 4 minutes? Is that possible?
Okay, that is fine. Thank you very much. In terms of the anti-bullying policy that we have, I'm not going to go through that, but these are some of the areas that the anti-bullying policy of the department is looking at, highlighting some of the things that I have indicated there, the definition and types of bullying, so that teachers and everybody who is in the care of learners is aware of these different types of bullying, the importance of stopping it, why is it important to stop it, the rights and responsibilities of everybody within the schools, and the procedures, which are, quite a critical element in terms of knowing how they are supposed to deal with it, the outcomes as well as consequences and links to other sector policies as well. In terms of us addressing it through life orientation, which is a subject compulsory to all learners that are attending school, looking at a human rights-based approach to teaching diversity and respect, because some of the bullying, will come as a result of those, that people have not been trained properly in terms of, diversity and respect of other people that they share space with. Being able to identify different categories of bullying is also one of the critical areas there. And then creating an environment where learners feel safe. I think I've mentioned that. I've mentioned the Interdepartmental Campaign, us working with other departments that I've mentioned. And this is being championed in the department by both our minister and our deputy minister. I think I will stop there and appreciate then the time that was given to me. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Sifiso, and I'm glad we didn't have another problem with the network. So thank you so much for your presentation. So I mean, I can see that Vanessa and Prof. Pillay have been quite actively answering many of the questions online. One of the questions, Sifiso, and I'm going to address this to you and to the audience. Please just put your questions in the chat box as well, and I'll sort of relay them. Sifiso, there were a couple of people who asked questions about what happens when, what's the kind of approach and the processes when children are bullied by teachers. Could you respond to that? Because there are a couple of people who were talking about how teachers are often the bully. Over to you, Sifiso.
Oh, thank you very much. You are right. It has happened in many instances where the complaints are there coming from the teacher and sometimes even coming from the principal. What parents in those instances do is to report via the school governing body, because we do believe that the first line of support should come within the schooling community itself. But obviously, some people did not find joy. We have seen instances of where parents and school learners have actually written directly to the minister. That has happened as well, and we attend to it. So in the department, as you know, that there would be various levels and various offices. We normally encourage learners as well as parents to report even if they've reported it at school, but you'll find that maybe there's still dissatisfaction in the way the school has handled it. So we would recommend that they visit their district offices. They can even take it up to the provincial offices, but those will be the lines of ensuring that the matter is reported. Especially when it is a teacher, the school principal will be the right person to go to where bullying comes from the teacher, as we have seen happening in some instances. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sifiso. Prof. Pillay, I see your camera turning on. Do you want to jump in there for that question, or any of the others that you've seen would be fine?
Thanks, Prof. Yes, just a thought that I think might address a number of the questions that have come through, understandably, that relate to the role of the school. What can the school do, etc.? And those are challenging questions because this is not an easy problem. But something that I've always felt strongly about, and is quite critical, in that I think we as parents have traditionally and to this day expected too much of our schools and our school teachers. Remember that it's not the duty of the school to bring up our children. It is not the duty of the school teacher to be bringing up our children, to be teaching our children morals and values and behaviors. That is a job for caregivers. We've got to do that at home. So certainly, yes, these problems do come up at school, and the various things, as Sifiso outlined, the various things that schools are trying, but it's an extremely challenging situation, especially considering that schools have so many children to deal with. all with different characteristics and demeanors and personalities. But I think if we're going to, as a society, leave all of this with schools, I think it's a huge mistake. We've got to share this. In fact, I think we've got to share this with much more of the responsibility being on us as caregivers. Thanks.
Thanks, Pillay. Yeah, I think that's a very, very important point. This is not just about individual kind of bullies or victims. It's not just about the Department of Education, just about schools. It's actually about communities and parents and all of us. Vanessa.
I just wanted to reinforce how vital it is, Prof. Pillay's point, in terms of working with the whole system. The school can't be expected to do this all themselves, and identifying kids at risk and families at risk, which does get very precarious and can then involve social development and stuff like that. But the child needs to be supported and cared for and taught at home, so that that stuff can then be carried to school. I do think it's unrealistic to expect teachers and schools to handle it all.
Thanks, Vanessa. One of the more recent questions from Rajeshri about how do we deal with bullies themselves? They're also growing children and may need to be assisted to relate to others without relying on harassment, bullying, or abusing others. And it might be good if each of the speakers could take a stab at that, because it feels like quite an important issue, because bullies are often present, obviously, as aggressive, as not very nice, but very often it's a very particular strategy to deal with a particular thing in their life. Often it kind of works. They may be in their terms, and that it's very easy to think that they're the perpetrator and don't need assistance. So maybe if I start with Sifiso, and then I'll go to Prof. Pillay, and then Vanessa, can you all just take a stab at Sifiso from the department's point of view, addressing the needs of the bully as well, what they're struggling with in their world as well. And yeah, thanks, Sifiso.
No, thank you. Yeah, you are 100% correct that, often we see them as perpetrators and we don't want to do anything to assist them. But often, sometimes bullying is a cry for help in its manifestation, that there are, underlying other factors that might be contributing to that particular person becoming a bully. And therefore, it is very important that we get to understand, get to find out the background of a learner, where they are coming from, especially if the child is a bully, because chances are we might find that within the family setting, they might be under other challenges that child is coming up with. So it's important that, in as much as we will be caring for the victim in any case, but we also not move and distance ourselves, in a position of authority as teachers in the school, but just to ensure that we seek for deeper understanding of the child. And in most cases, we will find something in the background of that child. I think also there was something that was on the platform regarding, that it is sometimes very difficult to deal with the emotional part, the emotional bullying and things like that. That what perhaps I can encourage there is that it's also very important that parents do have regular conversation with their children about school, because sometimes the child might not, be the first one to open up and indicate what is happening at a school level. But once, it's a daily thing or routine, that a parent will interact with their children, there is also some information that might come up through those engagements. I know that we live a busy life and often don't ask about school, but it's important that on a daily basis, we find out how was school, are you okay, are you happy, anything that is bothering you, questions like that on a daily basis would actually help. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Tafiso. Prof. Pillay.
Yeah, sure. I think there are a few approaches that can be tried, and we obviously don't have time to go through all of them, but just a couple that come to mind. The first one Vanessa mentioned earlier, the use of Dbt techniques, and particularly useful, I think, especially since it incorporates in it a didactic component, a psychoeducational component, which I think can be quite useful. That's one. The other is, and I'm thinking here back to, many of you may not be as old as I am, but I'm thinking back to my school years. When there was a child that had a bit of a behavior problem in the class, the school teacher often gave him a responsibility, like a class monitor or some other little duty. Now, if we come back to some of the stuff that I talked about earlier, and both of the other speakers also talked about, if we're looking at this issue of self-esteem and the child's need for recognition, so then let's play into that and afford the child some scenario, some opportunity where he or she can develop and feel important in a functional rather than dysfunctional way. So it reinforces his need to be recognized, but without being destructive. So there are things like that. And then just the last point, I think the one thing we don't want to do is to take this child on head on in the same kind of aggressive, violent manner that will do absolutely no good. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Prof. Pillay. Vanessa, do you want to?
Yes, I think the important thing, and a lot of it has been touched on by both Tafiso and Prof. Pillay, is to understand that bullies have their own pain. They are suffering in their own ways. I do think early identification, so in the communication that comes even through preschool, nursery school, you can already see some of the hallmarks of kids who are prone to engage in bullying, and how to, at an earlier stage, bring in parents, try and see and understand what's happening in the system and support the system. But I'm also aware that this is very labor-intense work, and it is about how can we help support teachers in the school, as well as maybe the student body, having a look at having student counselors in place, because in some places, a high school student might more readily speak to somebody, a monitor or a prefect, or somebody who is part of like a caring committee. And that could also be helping them counsel others, not to take on the full burden, but could help increase the resources available, because a lot of these kids that are bullying come from dysfunctional homes and have their own mental health struggles. And kids who have ADHD can be prone to this because of their difficulties with impulsivity and stopping beforehand. So I think early intervention is vital.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Vanessa. One of the other questions, and I think Vanessa started a reply, I think it's quite important from Verity, and it's about, obviously the broad brushstrokes are important, but what are some of the on-the-ground strategies of what actually worked? And I think we've definitely heard some of them from Prof. Pillay and Tafiso and Vanessa around intervening early, around dialectic behavior therapy, or a whole series of things. But I thought, does anybody else? We only got a couple of more minutes left, but and as I said, Vanessa shared what looks like a very useful online resource. I also know that there's a very intense, resource-intense model in Finland around bullying in schools that has showed, enormous successes. But does anybody, and maybe I'll start the other way around this time, start with Vanessa, just as perhaps the last couple of points, Vanessa, around, like specific strategies, and you may have already said enough, and that's fine, but any others to help? Yeah. Thanks.
Well, I think one of the things that could be drawn on is the life orientation program And perhaps when some of those elements, because I know bullying is part of it, but to practice role playing with the kids so they can practice taking turns, teaching them appropriate assertiveness skills, how to tune in and listen to what's going on. If you're feeling uncomfortable, how do you let the person know that this is going on? So I think there can be a whole lot of different ins, and how do you find those ins in a school environment and build up the resources?
Thanks, Vanessa. Incredibly helpful. Thank you. Prof. Pillay, final words.
Just very quickly, I think whenever you have a problem where there are many different approaches that are being suggested, that in itself usually tells us that there's no real quick fix to this. We're all struggling. And that is the case here, because really we're dealing with a personality problem. And, talk to psychologists who do psychotherapy with individuals. They'll tell you to change an individual's personality is a very difficult job. It's a very long-standing thing that has to be engaged in, but certainly something that should be tried. And I think the self-help address, web address that was given, like that, there are probably so many others that have to be tried. So I think it's a multifaceted thing. We need to try various techniques. Thanks.
Thanks, Prof. Pillay. When as you were talking, I remember it reminded me of a particular quote by an American investigative journalist from the early part of the 20th century who stated that, this is H.L. Mencken, who stated that for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. Sifiso, last words.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm just thinking, that we must never underestimate the values that are being taught, in an not in a formal learning setting, like maybe, extracurricular activities where learners are participating in sport, and there are so many values that that particular platform provides. And I think, it would assist in terms of shaping personalities, things like being gracious. Even if you have lost the match, you still have to go and shake somebody's hands. That kind of behavior, it goes a long way without actually being there a teacher teaching them, like in a formal classroom, but it is actually a kind of a value that we need to instill in young personalities that are still being developed. Thanks.
Thanks, Sifiso. So in summing up, thank you so much to the three speakers for all your wise words and lots of strategies. And it is a complex problem. There's no simple answer, and it involves everybody. But one of the things that struck me in the talks was this notion of power and agency, I suppose. And I'm a clinical psychologist by training, but don't really do much of that anymore. I'm more a public health researcher now, and I like trying to think of big solutions. And I think one of the solutions, not just for bullying, is I don't think we have properly, adequately created a society in which young people, children, adolescents, feel a sense of agency, feel a sense of power in the world, feel that real decisions, that they have power to affect those. And the most obvious manifestation of that is that we have this very arbitrary idea that at the age of 18, you can now vote. It's not based on anything. It's based on a figure that we have. Why not 15? Why not 16? Why not 14? We create situations in schools where there's very strict hierarchies, and in societies, and where the voices of young people aren't fully engaged with, aren't fully brought into the mix. And if we are to create a different way of thinking about this, and create a different kind of school atmosphere, school climate, community atmosphere, I do think that a key thing in that is creating a way to give voice, to hear the voices of young people in not just a tick box approach, but in a real, like, in-depth way of engaging with youth. And I think that is part of the solution. Again, it's not the solution. And everything else that the speakers have spoken about is part of the solution. And then a final point is, years and years ago, a colleague of mine always wanted to do the one randomized controlled trial, where what we would do is try and get parents or caregivers or whoever are the adults in their lives, the social carers, the grandmothers, next door neighbors maybe, that one of the non-negotiables in any place is that, and of course this is difficult in busy lives, but there's very often some adult who could do it, is that every single night of a child's life, every single night, that family would sit down in one way or another, usually around a meal, but even in context where there's not, but there's a moment, there's a time where families sit down and talk about the day. So it's basically about routine and engagement. And if that happened every single night of every child's life for the 18 years of their life, obviously babies aside, that would be a massive contribution, because that's when you problem solve and that's where you think about difficulty. So I'm a firm believer in routine and that kind of parental engagement as one of the other solutions potentially. So on that basis, again, just thank you so much to the three speakers. Thank you so much to Kutso for organizing it. And thank you so much for all the audience for your engagement, your fantastic questions. And just to say that Kutso has informed me that the recording of this will be shared, and that with the consent of the speakers, so will the presentation. So those of you asked about that, they will be shared. And thank you all, and have a wonderful weekend.